Hello, everyone. What I want to talk about today is something called once saved, always saved. It's pretty self explanatory, but it basically means that once we are saved, usually through a salvation prayer, that you cannot lose your salvation for any reason from that time on, no matter what you do. So, what does the Bible, specifically the New Testament, have to say about this? Well, let's check out a couple of verses, both written by the Apostle Paul. We'll start with this one from the book of Ephesians. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, that no one would boast. Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. Okay, that's one. It sounds very much like Paul is saying once saved, always saved, because we are saved by faith and not by works. There are others, but we're starting with an example. So now let's read another one in the book of Galatians, but also written by the Apostle Paul, and therefore the very same person. Now the works of the flesh are obvious, which are adultery, sexual immorality, uncleanness, lustfulness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, strife, jealousies, outbursts of anger, rivalries, divisions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these, of which I forewarn you, even as I also forewarned you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Galatians 5:19 through 21. Okay, that's a different letter, but the exact same writer. Both were written by the Apostle Paul. It definitely sounds different if what we're looking for is once saved, always saved. We're certainly not always saved if, quote, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God, end quote. For this reason, then, and for lack of any other name to give it, I'll just say that in this passage, it sounds like Paul is saying definitely not once saved, always saved. So what are we going to do with this? How can we understand this? Is Paul really saying two exactly opposite things so that one preacher can come along and say, this is so, but then another preacher can come along and say, no, the opposite is so, and they're both quoting from Paul? Are they both right? Well, this is what we have to decide, and it's clearly not as simple as people often think. So what I'm going to do here is simply make a suggestion based on how I approach the problem whenever it comes up, and I just gave you an example of it. I'm not going to read through all of the pertinent passages, although I will leave a list in the description of some verses that you might find helpful. The procedure is simple enough, though, because it is simply read one of each type of passage whenever the question comes up, just as I did here. I won't go through them all since they're scattered through the New Testament, but I will leave a few suggestions in the description. Then, if someone ever says something one way or another, and you're not sure, then simply read one passage where it sounds like Paul is saying, once saved, always saved, and then go on immediately and read another passage where it sounds like Paul is saying, not once saved, always saved. After you've done that a few times, you'll have the answer directly from the Bible, and you will no longer need it explained. All right. Now, before I finish this video, there is one more thing that I want to do. I was very careful in the last section to try not to put any of my own opinion into it so that no one could say that it came from me. I have simply given you an exercise in Bible reading that hopefully you will find useful for this question. I will now go on then and tell you something that is actually just from me, but I think that you might find useful. There is something that is in popular culture that I didn't even notice myself until it was pointed out. It continued to bother me enough after that, though, that one day I sat down and wrote something about it that I want to read for you here. It has to do with a very popular song called Imagine, written by John Lennon. If you haven't lived on the floor of the ocean for 50 years, I'm sure you've heard it. But like most people, you probably haven't thought much about what it actually says. In fact, it will be useful here because it is a secular version of what we're talking about. The questions raised here are, is God evil? And are his commandments and laws evil and wrong? This is how the secular community often views Christians. And because we are social creatures, it is something that we ourselves can even be influenced by. So I'm going to go ahead and read something for you that originated from the larger community, but that we too have to be careful of. Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven, no hell beneath us, above us only sky. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope one day you'll join us and the world will live as one. Recognize that? Well, unfortunately for John Lennon, he no longer has to imagine, and those who are following him aren't thinking about the risk they're taking. I mention it here because I want to dispel an urban myth. The atheist idea embodied in Lennon's song Imagine is that God is evil and that only getting rid of the belief in God, heaven, and hell can bring peace and unity on earth. That's a bit unlikely, but you can see how popular it has become even among those who don't stop to think about what they're really saying. So let me suggest that we imagine something else for a moment. Just for a moment, let's take a closer look at these 10 commandments. I won't have time to go over them here, so for now, they can be found in Exodus 20, 3 through 17, and Deuteronomy 5, 7 through 21. All right. To an observer of human nature, here's how these commandments really work. The 10 commandments are difficult to do. They just seem wrong. And it is very hard to understand why anyone would want to even try to do such things when you're doing them to someone else. If someone does these things to me, though, they become instantly crystal clear, if even only briefly. Is this not so? It can be an amazing thing to watch. The same person might bitterly complain one moment and then casually turn around and do the same thing to someone else, with no comprehension of any connection between the events. Consider the thief who believed that what he took was unimportant and no harm was done. This can be a way of life for some. But let someone steal from the thief, and for that one moment, he will understand. Or consider the idea of sexual freedom. No need to photobomb, we all know where we live. But let that same person come home one day and find their spouse in bed with someone else, and for that one moment, to that one person who did not understand what was wrong, All is now very clear. Now, also, since Mr. Lennon has us considering war, let's go on and consider the ninth commandment. Since no war can be begun or waged without the bearing of false witness, both in anger and as a planned strategy, we may be sure that when World War III starts, this one will be at front and center. In fact, it's already reaching crescendo. This, that is, false witness as a partner to warlike activity, is currently one of the main reasons for the threat of nuclear war. Still, it's the same thing. The bearing of false witness against your neighbor is probably the most common sin that no one ever commits. It has both earthly as well as eternal consequences, and most people seem never to have even heard of it. That is, until you're on the receiving end, being accused of something that you know you didn't do, and it should be obvious to a reasonable person that you didn't do, and you're being accused anyway. Then you won't need any more explanation. That is the ninth commandment. It happens all the time. You can look for it. Consider also murder. We wouldn't want ourselves or our loved ones murdered, but we don't see anything wrong with our own hate, anger, resentment, gossip, suspicion, greed, deception, and selfishness that we all know that any murder mystery must have. This is why Jesus said anger and unforgiveness is murder in our heart. Very few people commit actual murder without hating someone first. Okay, those are some of the obvious ones, and hopefully that gives the idea. I just want to do one more, though, because it's the same, even if it doesn't seem as obvious at first. Consider Commandment 4, the Sabbath. Many today, even among the churches, see the Sabbath as just some ancient legalism from an ancient religion with no meaning. It's just some kind of tradition or ceremony that, as Christians, we're no longer required to perform. Did I get that right? Observing the Sabbath has no purpose, and there's no reason for anyone to care. When you're doing it to someone else. Let someone make you work 7 days a week without end, though, and it might feel a little different. It won't kill you, but this is the one commandment that actually expresses this idea when God says, "Remember that you were once servants in Egypt." What has that got to do with it? Well, if servants have to work 7 days a week, then that's only confusing when you're doing it to someone else. Does it need to be a law to work? Well, God says it does. There are a couple I haven't covered, but hopefully you get the idea. One way or another, they're all like that. It always makes sense when you're on the receiving end. Imagine, then, a world with no murder, even if you're a king. No theft, even if you're a country. No lies, even to yourself. No false accusations without proof, not even by the powerful. No casually broken families. No greed. Imagine that. Okay, so that was something I wrote in terms of something that's going on in the larger community. Oftentimes today, people don't believe in God because they've been convinced that God is going to tell them to do something that's wrong, and we know that's not the case. I'm bringing it up here because we are talking about once saved, always saved, and I'm suggesting that the answer to that is to go to those passages in the Bible and read them, and make sure to read them all, not just the ones that sound like they go one way or the other. When doing that, though, it's important to not fall into this particular trap. When we talk about sin, It is always, whether it's the Ten Commandments or any of the commandments that Jesus gave, it is always something that, even though we might not find it easy to not do to someone else, it's still always something that we would not want someone to do to us. And that is the way it is for all of God's commandments. If you go through them, they're all the same. However you might feel about it when you first hear it, every single one is something that you would not want someone to do to you. And that's why it's called a sin.